A winter evening in 2018, which at first seemed quiet and serene, was suddenly filled with the sound of gunfire, shattering the peace of a residential neighborhood in Regina, Saskatchewan. Police officers responding to a call from concerned neighbors saw a horrific scene. Three bodies in the cozy home of a young married couple. Among the dead were a 28-year-old basketball coach and a 17-year-old cheerleader, his most talented student. However, the most shocking fact was that the third victim, the coach's pregnant wife, was still breathing. She was immediately taken to the hospital in critical condition. What could have happened that night? How did these three people get involved in a deadly tragedy that shook the entire community? This is a story of love, betrayal, obsession, and the consequences that left a deep mark on the lives of many people. Snow covered the streets of the quiet suburb of Regina, where their spacious two-story house stood, seemingly a symbol of home. Lamont Obagi, the 29-year-old coach of the school's basketball team, was known not only as a talented mentor, but also as a role model for young people. His students admired him, perceiving him as an older brother who always supports, motivates, and inspires them to believe in themselves. Lamont's wife, 27-year-old Imani Dyson, taught elementary school at a local school. Her kindness and natural ability to care for others made her a favorite among the children. Those who saw them together often described the couple as perfect, young, educated, friendly, and always ready to support the community. In mid-January, just a few days before their fourth wedding anniversary, Imani decided to surprise Lamont. She bought a small white baby bodysuit with the words "Daddy's Champion" on it. In the evening, when Lamont returned from training, she handed him this gift along with a pregnancy test. The joyful sparkle in her eyes and her happy smile left no doubt how excited she was. At first, Lamont just froze in place in surprise, but then he smiled and hugged his wife tightly. He assured her that the news made him happy, even though he was anxious in his heart. Was he ready for such a serious step? Will he be able to provide everything his future family needs? These thoughts began to torment him, but he did not dare to open up to Iman. At first, their lives remained unchanged. Imani went to school every morning, and Lamont went to training. In the evening, they spent time together as usual, having dinner, sharing the news of the day, and discussing plans for the child's future. However, later on, Lamont began to come home later and later. His explanations seemed quite reasonable. Additional training before crucial matches, or support for one of the players in a difficult period. Imani always trusted her husband. She attributed his fatigue to work-related difficulties and tried to be his support. However, over time, she began to notice small details that made her uneasy. For example, his phone was always lying face down. While he used to be eager to share events from his training, now his responses were laconic and sometimes evasive. The neighbors often saw them together in the yard. Imani was adding food to the bird feeder they had once hung together, and Lamont was shoveling snow. They looked like a normal, happy couple, but behind the closed doors of their home, an invisible tension gradually built up. Imani's students had always remembered her as a smiling and friendly teacher, but lately they had noticed that she often stared out the window, as if she were thinking about something important. Her colleagues also noticed that she was less energetic. Instead of her usual coffee, she now drank tea and sometimes gently held her stomach with a slight smile. Lamont, on the other hand, was spending more and more time in the gym, even after training sessions were over. Players said that he stayed to allegedly analyze the game. During these moments, he was often seen in the company of Naima Kamara, the captain of the cheerleading team, who always seemed to find a reason to stay longer than the others. At first glance, the cold winter of 2018 in Regina did not seem to disturb the coziness and harmony in the Obagi household. Their lives seemed to be calm and measured, but underneath this apparent idyll, conflicts and feelings were already flaring up that would later turn into tragedy. None of those who saw Lamont and Imani in those days even suspected how dramatically their fate would change in the near future. Naima Kamara grew up in the family of Samson and Essie Kamara, who emigrated to Regina from Liberia in the early 2000s. Her parents worked hard to provide their daughter with a stable life, but their constant employment deprived Naima of warmth and attention. Samson worked as a truck driver during the day and as a security guard at night. Essie, as a nurse at a local hospital, often worked long shifts and spent many nights on call. Their lives were a continuous cycle of responsibilities, which often left Naima, an only child, alone at home. Naima's childhood years were spent in loneliness. In the evenings, she used to sit at the window of her small house, watching other children playing with their parents in the yard or walking together. Her evenings were spent in silence, sometimes broken only by the sound of the TV on. Instead of bedtime stories, she would hear phone calls from her parents, who wanted to make sure she was okay. However, these conversations were short and devoid of warmth, like a mechanical duty. In her teenage years, the inner emptiness left by the lack of attention in her childhood began to manifest itself in Naima's behavior. She sought approval and recognition from others, trying to fill this emotional vacuum. After joining the cheerleading team, Naima quickly became one of the brightest and most visible girls. Her confident behavior in public hid a deep insecurity. She began to seek closeness with older men, hoping to find in them the support she lacked in her family. Lamont Obaji first caught her attention when he showed up at one of the cheerleaders' practices to discuss performing with the basketball team. His charisma, calm voice, and statuesque posture immediately impressed Naima. He seemed unlike anyone else, a man who exuded the warmth and stability she had dreamed of since childhood. Lamont spoke to her as a peer, not as a simple schoolgirl. He listened intently when she shared her ideas for choreography, and even praised her for her leadership skills several times. These moments stayed in her memory for a long time, making her want to communicate with him as often as possible. Naima started looking for excuses to stay after training. She explained it by saying that she needed to help with cleaning the sports equipment or preparing for the next class. But in reality, her real goal was quite different. She wanted to be close to Lamont, to hear his voice and to feel important in his presence. Naima's friends noticed that she had changed, but they didn't pay much attention to it. In their opinion, she was just trying to improve her skills. Only a few of the teammates would occasionally joke that she was into the coach. Naima would only smile in response, but these jokes did not stop her. On the contrary, they only increased her sympathy for Lamont. Samson and Essie Kamar were so absorbed in their work that they did not even notice the changes in their daughter's behavior. Their home remained as quiet as ever. Naima's late returns or her frequent mood swings remained beyond their notice. Although Naima was eager to be the center of attention, she did not even try to share her experiences with her parents. Naima was described by her classmates as a confident but sometimes self-absorbed girl. Recently, she spent more time in the gym, even though the workouts were optional. Her academic performance deteriorated, but she hid it from her parents, explaining her exhaustion by her busy schedule. For a long time, Lamont did not pay attention to the fact that Naima tried to stay by his side as long as possible. To him, she was just another student who appreciated his teaching methods. However, her persistence, frequent compliments, and unobtrusive questions about his personal life began to cause him some concern. For Naima, Lamont was the embodiment of an ideal. She did not see any flaws or weaknesses in him, but only what she was missing: stability, care, and confidence. Her admiration gradually turned into an obsession that began to influence her actions. Naively believing that Lamont could fill her emotional void, she did not realize how dangerous her path was becoming. No one could have imagined that a simple interaction between a trainer and a student would lead to consequences that would destroy everything. At first, everything seemed quite innocent. Naima Kamara was increasingly staying after the basketball team's practice sessions, offering to help Lamont Obadiah. She would pick up balls, put away equipment, or just stand silently by, watching him work. Her explanation was always simple. She just wanted to help or learn more about basketball strategies. At such moments, Naima began to gradually open up to Lamont. Her conversations quickly turned from ordinary topics to personal ones. She talked about her loneliness at home, her parents' constant work, and lack of emotional support. She emphasized how often she felt abandoned and admitted that she had never had a person in her life who listened to her carefully. Despite his best efforts to maintain a professional distance, Lamont could not help but notice how desperate Naima was to get his attention. In her stories, he saw a reflection of his own inner feelings and the emotional tension caused by the problems in his marriage. Her words about loneliness resonated in his soul, awakening a desire to talk to her further. One evening, after another training session, Naima stayed longer than usual. She went up to Lamont, who was checking sports equipment, and struck up a conversation that turned out to be more personal than ever before. Her voice sounded gentle as she said, "You are so kind to everyone. It seems so natural to you." Her tone was full of admiration that he couldn't help but notice. This time, her words and gestures were even more frank. She leaned closer than usual, touching his shoulder lightly and added, "You make me feel so safe." Lamont felt contradictory feelings struggling within him. On the one hand, he was uncomfortable, but on the other hand, her attention flattered him. Her hints became bolder and bolder. At one of the next moments, when they were alone again, she said bluntly, "You are probably the best man I have ever met." Lamont, being in a state of emotional exhaustion due to the troubles in his family life, could not immediately dismiss these words. The tension between them grew gradually. One evening, when the gym was empty and everyone had gone home, Lamont and Naima were alone. She came closer to him than ever before, and looking directly into his eyes said, "Do you realize how important you are to me?" That evening, they shared their first kiss. It was a brief moment, but it became a symbolic violation of the boundaries they had tried to keep for so long. After that incident, their relationship quickly began to develop into something much more. During one of their subsequent meetings at school, their connection went beyond mere conversation to physical intimacy. For Naima, this was her first experience of intimacy, which only strengthened her emotional attachment to Lamont. She began to see him not only as a mentor, but also as a person who filled her inner loneliness. Naima's behavior began to change. She became even more devoted. She wrote him notes that she secretly left in his office and always found reasons to stay around longer. Her classmates noticed that she became more withdrawn and less outgoing. Her friends saw her less often in company as she spent most of her time alone, thinking about her meetings with Lamont. For Lamont, it was a life on two fronts. At home, he tried to maintain the image of a loving husband, but his emotional distance was becoming more and more apparent. He started spending more time in the gym, justifying it with the need for additional training. None of them realized that their actions were only bringing the inevitable tragedy closer. What was initially a hidden relationship gradually began to open up through small details that became visible to others. Amani noticed changes in Lamont's behavior early on. He began to come home later and later, citing preparing for matches or unscheduled training. His phone was always with the screen facing down, and he stopped leaving it unattended, even at home. One day, when Lamont fell asleep on the couch after coming home late, Imani decided to look at his phone. Her heart sank when she saw a message from an unknown number. One of them was short but disturbing. "Why aren't you answering? We need to talk." The other revealed more. "I can't do this anymore. We have to be together." At breakfast, Imani decided to cautiously start a conversation with Lamont. "Lamont, you've changed lately," she said softly, trying to remain calm. "Is there something you're hiding from me?" "What are you talking about, Imani?" he replied, not even looking up from his coffee cup. "I saw the messages on your phone," she said, trying not to lose her temper. Her voice trembled a little. "Who's writing this?" "It's just one of the students I'm helping," he quickly dismissed, trying to look casual. "You know how many responsibilities I have." Imani was not satisfied with his explanation, but decided not to press. Her intuition told her that there was something much more serious behind his words. At the time, Naima was becoming more and more immersed in her obsession with Lamont. He became for her not just a coach or a lover, but the only person who, in her opinion, truly understood her. But when she found out that Imani was pregnant, it was a real blow to her. For hours, she sat in her room, replaying the news in her mind. "He said I was important to him," she whispered, looking in the mirror. "And now they're having a baby? It's not right." Naima began sending Lamont messages that intertwined pleas with hidden threats. "How could you do this to me? I was sure we were special. If you continue to ignore me, I will tell everyone about what is happening between us. You know it will ruin your life." Several times she waited for him outside the gym after training, trying to get him to talk. Her voice was full of emotions, ranging from indignation to despair. "I'm not going to let you leave like that, Lamont. You can't do this to me. You said I was important to you. Why are you pushing me away?" Lamont tried to avoid these conversations, but each one left him in a state of emotional turmoil. Realizing that the situation had become uncontrollable, he decided to put an end to the relationship. One evening after training, Lamont was alone with Naima to explain everything. "Naima, we have to stop," he said, trying to avoid her gaze. "What do you mean?" Her voice betrayed a mixture of anxiety and anger. "This has gone too far. I can't take it anymore. I am a married man, and my wife and I are expecting a child." Her face turned red, first with anger and then with despair. "You can't just leave me like this. You said I was important to you. How can you end it so easily?" "It was a mistake, Naima," Lamont replied, trying to remain calm. "I'm sorry it happened." His words seemed to break her. She didn't cry, but her eyes reflected cold, restrained rage. "If I can't be with you, then no one else will," she whispered almost automatically. That evening, Naima left the gym, leaving Lamont to deal with his guilt. He had no idea that her words were not just empty threats. After the breakup, her behavior became increasingly impulsive. She started writing him anonymous letters accusing him of cheating and manipulation. One day, Lamont found a note left on the hood of his car that read, "You will answer for this." Naima's friends noticed that she became distant, began to avoid socializing, and often missed classes. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and her emotions unpredictable. Naima Kamara sat in her room holding her head. Her thoughts were racing, and her emotions were rolling in waves that were impossible to contain. Anger flared up inside her, mingling with pain and despair. Everything she had felt, everything she had said or done seemed useless after Lamont's words. It was a mistake. These words only made her suffering worse. How could he so easily erase everything that had been between them? Her mind refused to accept it. Thoughts chaotically replaced each other. Cry, beg, write another message. But she had already done all of these things, and not a single attempt had worked. Her anger, which had previously been directed at Lamont, found a new target, Imani, his wife. Naima stood up, feeling a wave of determination wash over her. Her gaze settled on the closet where Samson, her father, kept his gun. She had seen him take it out more than once to clean it. Her heart was beating fast, but her body acted as if on its own. She opened the cabinet and pulled out the weapon. She'd never held a gun before, but the cold weight of it felt strangely calming. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at the weapon for a long time, running through possible scenarios in her mind. Her hands trembled slightly, but that did not weaken her resolve. "She ruined my whole life," Naima whispered, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her thoughts kept returning to Lamont's words. He had called their relationship a mistake, but she knew that it was only because of his duty to Imani, a woman who Naima was convinced would never be able to understand him the way she did. Naima left the house around 2 in the afternoon. She was sure that Lamont was still at work at that time, and her goal was clearly defined, his family's house. When she got there, the cozy 2-story house in a quiet suburb seemed to her to be the epitome of the perfect picture that had caused her life to be ruined. She stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, breathing in the frosty air, trying to organize her thoughts. Her hands nervously clutched the strap of the bag containing her gun. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door and pressed the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened. Imani stood on the doorstep, smiling, wearing a warm sweater and holding a cup of tea. "Hi," she said in a friendly tone, looking at Naima a little surprised. "You're from the Lamont team, right? What's up?" "Yes," Naima replied briefly, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Imani nodded, stepping back a few steps and inviting her inside. She had no idea that this young girl could be dangerous. Naima entered the house, looking around carefully. The cozy atmosphere of the living room only increased her inner tension. Her eyes landed on the table, where a framed photo of Imani and Lamont stood, and next to it was an ultrasound image of their unborn child. This detail fueled her anger even more. "Did you want to say something?" Imani asked, sitting down on the couch and gesturing for Naima to sit next to her. Naima remained standing, unmoving, her eyes darting from one part of the room to another until they met Imani's. "Do you know that your husband doesn't love you?" she suddenly asked in a cold, sharp tone. Imani was surprised, but her calmness did not disappear. What do you mean? Why are you saying that? Naima took a step forward, her hands visibly trembling. You ruined everything. He could have been happy with me if it wasn't for you, she exclaimed loudly. At that moment, Imani realized that this meeting was not accidental. Her smile disappeared and her face tensed. You are wrong, she replied gently, raising her hands in a gesture of reconciliation. Let's talk calmly. But Naima had already lost control. With a sudden movement, she opened her bag, pulled out a gun, and pointed it directly at Imani. You have to leave. Part with him. Give it to me, or I will make you do it, she hissed, clutching the weapon ominously. Imani, though frightened, tried to remain calm. Naima, I don't know what happened between you two, but this is wrong. Put the gun down and we'll talk about it. Her words only inflamed Naima's anger even more. She began to scream, accusing Imani of interfering with her fate. Her hand trembled and she took a few steps forward. He called it a mistake, but I wasn't the mistake. It was you. This is your child. You ruined my whole life. Imani tried to get up, but at that moment a shot rang out. The bullet hit her in the stomach and she fell to the floor. Blood quickly began to spread on her clothes and a cry of pain escaped her lips. About 15 minutes later, Lamont returned home, unaware of what had happened. Opening the door, he froze in horror. Imani was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and Naima was standing next to her, a gun in her hand. Her eyes were blank, although her hands were still visibly trembling. What have you done? Lamont shouted, rushing to his wife. She got what she deserved, Naima replied, her voice sounding eerily calm. Lamont stood up, looking at her with a combination of fury and horror. You've gone mad. This has to end. Naima raised her gun and pointed it at him. How could you do this to me? You said I was important to you. You betrayed me. His attempt to stop her ended with another shot. Naima shot Lamont, and he fell to the floor. Naima stood over the two motionless bodies, breathing heavily. Her eyes were fixed on the pools of blood that were quickly spreading across the floor. Everything she had done began to sink in. Her face expressed indescribable horror, and tears streamed down her cheeks without stopping. I just wanted to be happy, she whispered, raising the gun to her temple. The last shot rang out in the house, putting an end to this tragic story. At 3:45 p.m., a neighbor across the street called the police after hearing 3 loud gunshots that disturbed the peace of his neighborhood. 7 minutes later, a patrol car arrived at Obadiah's house. The open door indicated a possible threat, so the officers quickly went inside. The scene that opened before them in the living room was so gruesome that it was hard to imagine it even in the most horrible dream. Lamont Obaji was lying face down on the floor. The blood from his body was spreading over the wooden parquet, mixing with the fragments of the broken coffee table. Not far from the couch was the body of Naima Kamara. Her hand lay limply on the floor, and the gun slipped from her unmoving fingers. Her eyes were open, but her frozen gaze saw nothing. However, the biggest shock was in store for the officers when they spotted Imani Obaji. She was still alive. Lying on the floor, she clutched her hands on her stomach, which was bleeding uncontrollably. Her breathing was weak, but she was trying to whisper something. One of the policemen leaned over her, trying to stop the bleeding with a towel he had found in the kitchen. Hold on, the ambulance is on the way, one of the policemen said, trying to calm her down and give her confidence. Imani barely raised her head, her eyes glistening with tears. The baby, please save her, she whispered as tears streamed down her face. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. Paramedics quickly applied temporary bandages to stop the bleeding and carefully transferred her to a stretcher. Her condition was critical. A weak pulse and significant blood loss left no time for delay. Do everything you can, the officer said as the paramedics carried the stretcher into the ambulance. At the hospital, the medical team immediately began to fight for her life. Her injuries were serious. The bullet had hit her in the abdomen and damaged several organs, including her uterus. The loss of blood was so significant that even an emergency surgery did not guarantee success. When she was brought into the operating room, the doctors made every effort. They tried to save not only the mother, but also the unborn child. However, due to the severe injuries, they failed to save the baby. The operation lasted more than 4 hours. When Imani woke up from anesthesia, she felt a severe pain in her stomach. Her consciousness gradually cleared, and when she looked around, she saw a doctor standing next to her. "How is my baby?" she asked in a weak voice, looking at him with hope. The doctor sighed heavily and looked down as if trying to find words. "We did everything we could, but we couldn't save the baby. We are very sorry." His words struck Imani like a lightning strike. She burst into tears, her body shaking with uncontrollable pain. She could not say anything, only covered her face with her hands. "Why, why did this happen to me?" she said hoarsely, looking up at the ceiling. A nurse who was nearby gently sat down by her bedside and took her hand, trying to support her. But no words could comfort her. Imani had lost everything, her husband, her child, and the peace that had once been part of her life. The next day, the story became the top story in Regina. The headline screamed, "Tragedy of the Commons. Young girl shoots coach and attacks his pregnant wife." The local community was shocked. Lamont was known as a talented coach and mentor to young people. People could not believe that such a man could be at the center of such a scandal. The school where Lamont worked became the epicenter of events. Students, parents, and local residents gathered near the schoolyard to express their grief. Many left flowers and notes of support for Imani. "He was the best coach. He always believed in us," said one of his students. However, not everyone expressed condolences. There were also those who condemned Lamont, believing that his relationship with his student caused the tragedy. Heated debates broke out on social media, and people expressed different opinions about the situation. A few weeks after the incident, the Obagi family's house was empty. Snow completely covered the yard and the roof, giving the house an even greater appearance of abandonment and sadness. The windows remained closed, the doors were locked, and not a single detail reminded us of how life once bustled here. This house has become a symbol of destruction. It became a place where one story ended and another filled with pain, loss, and disappointment had just begun.